Hey guys, tonight we're going way back. So get comfortable, pull up your blanket and let's drift somewhere cold, like really cold. The kind of cold where your nose hurts and your breath hangs in the air like a ghost. Because tonight, we're talking about how Native Americans, especially the Plains tribes, managed to survive, sleep, and actually stay warm inside Tipis during brutal winter nights. No space heaters, no fleece socks, no YouTube tutorials titled 5 Genius Camping Hacks to Survive -40 degrees Fahrenheit. Just buffalo hides, bone tools, and pure skill. And somehow, they didn't freeze to death. So yeah, they deserve a slow clap, or at least a slow, relaxing bedtime story. Let's start by imagining this. It's midnight on the Great Plains, maybe somewhere around modern-day South Dakota or Montana. The land is flat and endless. The sky's a black sheet scattered with 1,000 tiny fires. The snow is thick, crunching under moccasins. You can hear the wind not howling, just moving, like the world's biggest exhale. And in that vast emptiness, there's a small cluster of conical shadows, Tipis standing steady in the cold. Inside each one, a family sleeps, quiet, warm, mostly. That's the image we're going to float through tonight. Because these structures, Tipis, were small miracles of design. They weren't just tents, they were aerodynamic, portable, and perfectly tuned to the rhythms of life on the plains. The shape of survival at Tipi wasn't some random con-shaped tent like you might imagine from a kid-esque cartoon. It was an engineered shelter born from centuries of trial, error, and frozen fingers. The general shape, tall, circular base, sloping sides, had a reason. It directed wind smoothly around it, so it didn't flap or collapse. Snow slid right off the hides instead of piling on top. The smoke from the central fire rose naturally through the top vent, keeping the air breathable without letting out all the heat. And that central fire, that was the heart of the whole setup. They didn't burn big roaring fires like in Hollywood movies. That would have filled the tipi with smoke and burned everyone alive. Instead, they built small, controlled fires right in the center, surrounded by stones. Those stones acted like ancient space heaters. They absorbed heat from the flames and slowly released it through the night. The inside of a tipi wasn't just one big open space either. The ground was covered in layers. First, a mat of grass or brush for insulation. Then animal hides, usually buffalo. The family's bedding sat on top, sometimes with extra hides draped over them for warmth. Basically, the Plains tribes invented the double-layered heated camping setup hundreds of years before Ray sold it for $499. Insulation by buffalo. You can't really talk about warmth on the plains without mentioning the buffalo or bison, if we're being proper. Everything about that animal screamed survival. The hides, when tanned and softened, became the outer wall of the tipi, thick, durable, and heavy enough to block wind. In summer, they might use thinner hides and even leave gaps at the bottom for ventilation. But in winter, they went full polar edition. They'd double up the hides, sometimes even add an interior liner, another set of hides that hung inside like a curtain, leaving a small air gap between the layers. That gap acted like insulation, trapping heat. It's the same principle as double-glazed windows, only theirs smelled faintly like buffalo and smoke instead of Windex. Inside, everyone slept close to the ground, not in the cold air rising near the top. People often slept with their feet toward the fire, heads tucked under fur blankets. The idea was simple: keep your core warm, don't fight the cold, just coexist with it. And honestly, they did a better job than most modern campers. Ventilation, smoke, and the secret of the flaps. One of the most impressive parts of a tipi was its ventilation system. At the top of the structure, there were smoke flaps, 2 adjustable hide panels held open or closed with poles. You could tilt them depending on the wind direction. If the wind came from the north, you angled the flaps south so the smoke went out smoothly instead of swirling inside. That sounds minor, but it was essential, because yes, the tipi had a fire burning all night, but the air never became unbreathable. There was a delicate balance: let out just enough smoke, but not enough heat. So families constantly adjusted those flaps, especially during storms. It was basically prehistoric thermostat management. And when the fire died down, the hides kept the heat trapped long enough for everyone to drift through the night without freezing. So, imagine lying there, you're wrapped in warm hides. The firelight flickers, making shadows dance up the walls. The air smells faintly of cedar and smoke. Outside, snow falls silently. Inside, it's still and warm. That's what sleep looked like. Not luxurious, but comfortable in the way survival often is. Sleeping with the seasons, the plains weren't just cold, they were extreme. Summers could hit 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Winters could plunge below -30 degrees Fahrenheit. So the tipi wasn't a one-size-fits-all tent. It was modular, adaptable. In summer, the outer hides were lifted slightly off the ground to let air flow through. The smoke flaps opened wide. Fires were smaller or skipped entirely. The people might even sleep outside on clear nights, just under the stars. But in winter, everything changed. The floor was built up with extra insulation. The door flap faced east, away from the worst winds. The hides were staked down tight to the ground. The smoke flaps closed just enough to hold in warmth. Sometimes snow itself helped when it piled up around the bottom of the tipi. It acted like extra insulation. It sounds counterintuitive, but snow is actually a decent thermal barrier. Eskimos knew that too, so did prairie dogs. Nature was the original design consultant, and when the storms came, families didn't panic. They just went quiet. The tipi would creak, the wind would whistle, but inside it stayed steady. Life inside, it's easy to picture Tipis as cold and empty, but they were actually cozy and alive with small details. The interior walls were often decorated, painted symbols, family marks, or scenes from hunts and dreams. There were storage bags, tools, children's toys, and dried meat hanging above to keep it safe from animals. Women usually managed the space. The tipi itself belonged to them, in most tribes. The hides, the structure, the organization, it was all part of the household. And when it came time to move, which might happen several times a year, the entire structure could be taken down in under an hour. The hides rolled up. The poles were tied together and dragged behind horses or dogs in a frame called a travois. In other words, it was the world's first mobile home, minimalist, aerodynamic, and surprisingly efficient. Firelight dreams now. Let's float back to the sleeping part. There was a rhythm to those nights. Fires were kept small and steady, often maintained by someone half awake. If the flames went too low, someone would add another stick of wood. Not because they feared the cold, but because that fire was a living thing, part of the family's routine. Children fell asleep to the crackling sound. Adults whispered stories. The elders spoke of hunts, or spirits, or weather signs. The warmth was shared literally. Hides were spread wide enough for everyone, and smaller children often slept between parents or older siblings for extra warmth. It was a world built around cooperation, because, in a place that cold, individualism was, let's say, discouraged by frostbite. When the wind howled, of course, not every night was peaceful. The plains could summon winds that felt like they were trying to rip the world apart. But even then, the tipi held its ground. The poles, usually 12 to 20 long lodgepole pines, were arranged in a tripod base, then layered with more poles around the frame, all meeting at the top. Once the hides were wrapped and tied down with rawhide thongs, it was solid. Some tipis stood through storms that blew down nearby trees. The shape deflected the wind, the hides flexed instead of tearing, and the whole structure settled deeper into the snow instead of tipping over. That kind of engineering didn't come from luck. It came from hundreds of winters and thousands of small corrections passed through generations. European reactions: when European explorers first saw tipis, they were confused. They called them tents, assuming they were primitive versions of their own canvas shelters. But the irony was that tipis were better. They were warmer, lighter, easier to set up, and far more suited to nomadic life. One early trader wrote that a Lakota camp could appear on the horizon in the morning and vanish by evening, leaving no trace but trampled grass. Which, honestly, sounds like the dream of every modern minimalist influencer, except these people did it out of necessity, not aesthetics. The hidden science of warmth. If you break it down, the reason tipis works so well comes down to physics and psychology. Heat rises, but the sloped walls of the tipi pushed it inward, toward the sleeping area. The air circulation from the smoke hole kept oxygen levels balanced. The thick hides acted as both insulation and thermal mass, slowly absorbing and radiating heat. It was passive climate control, built entirely from natural materials. The people who designed it didn't have thermometers or building codes, they just knew. Because every winter the ones who didn't figure it out, well, they didn't make it to spring. That's how knowledge evolves when the stakes are survival. The sound of a winter night. If you could somehow fall asleep in one of those tipis, you'd notice something. The sound has no electric hum, no cars, no ticking clocks, just the soft hiss of fire, the faint rattle of hides shifting in the wind, and maybe a low snore from someone who spent all day chasing buffalo. Outside, coyotes cry somewhere far off. Inside, the warmth feels like it belongs to you. And even though everything outside is frozen solid, you'd still be comfortable enough to drift into dreams. That's how they did it, not through luck, through design, patience, and a deep understanding of how to live with the land instead of against it. Hey, again. So, we're still out there on the open plains, endless sky, endless snow, endless quiet. You can almost feel the cold just listening. But inside the tipi, things are calm. The fire's glowing low, there's a faint hum of breathing, and someone probably just shifted under a pile of buffalo hides. Before that peace existed, though, someone had to build it. And that part, the setup, the labor, the rituals, was as much about community as it was about architecture. Raising the tipi, setting up a tipi wasn't random improvisation. It followed a pattern, almost like a sacred dance. The first 3 poles formed the tripod, which acted as the skeleton. Women usually chose which poles went first. They knew which ones balanced best, which had the right flex and weight. Then came the others, added one by one until the frame looked like a forest of long spears leaning inward. The hides, usually 10 to 20 large buffalo skins sewn together, were wrapped around the frame. They were lifted, stretched, and pinned with wooden pegs or rawhide laces, and there was meaning in it all. For many tribes, like the Lakota or Cheyenne, The tipi symbolized the universe, the poles reaching upward to the sky, the circular floor representing the earth, the fire in the center as the heart of life. So building a tipi wasn't just making shelter. It was recreating order, turning wild space into a home. Women, work, and warmth. You'll notice that the tipi, the ultimate survival structure, was largely managed by women. They owned it, repaired it, packed it, and chose where it stood. The men might bring the poles and hides, but the women made the home. They decided how close to pitch near the next family, how to angle the door to avoid wind, and when to move on. During winter, this skill became critical. A poorly set tipi could mean drafts that froze everyone by dawn, but a well-built one, that meant a warm night and the energy to hunt or travel tomorrow. It's no exaggeration to say that winter survival on the plains depended more on women's precision than on men's bravery. Inside, women managed the fire, rotated hides to dry, and even adjusted the smoke flaps while the men slept. Because if anyone was going to fix a bad airflow situation, it was definitely the person who noticed it first. Rituals of construction. Building a tipi sometimes had a ceremonial side too. Some tribes treated the act as sacred, performing short prayers or gestures before the first pole was raised. The direction of the door, often east, symbolized the rising sun and renewal. In certain tribes, the number of poles mattered. The Blackfoot, for example, often used 17, each one said to have symbolic meaning. It wasn't superstition. Exactly, it was a way of keeping structure and memory alive through repetition. You didn't just build a house, you reenacted something ancient. And honestly, that sense of rhythm of doing something your grandmother's grandmother did probably made the cold nights feel a little less lonely. Heat from earth and spirit. Now, warmth wasn't only about fire. It was also about design, habit, and psychology. The fire in the center burned low and steady, but the floor itself was an unsung hero. Before any hides went down, families would clear snow and sometimes dig a shallow depression in the center. That lower area helped control the airflow. Cooler air settled near the ground, while warm air circulated above where people slept. In some camps, ashes from old fires were mixed with dirt to make a packed floor, insulating, dry, and surprisingly comfortable. And then came the hides, thick as a mattress. In some cases, families even had special winter hides, heavier, lined with fur. You'd lie there, wrapped in that dense warmth, listening to the snow outside, and for a few hours, the entire world narrowed to one circle of comfort. The communal warmth of a camp, of course. A single tipi was cozy, but a camp full of them created a microclimate. When several tipis were grouped together, their fires and bodies collectively warmed the air just enough to make the surrounding snow melt a little slower. The scent of wood smoke hung in the air, curling above dozens of small fires like lazy ghosts. Families visited each other even in winter, walking through narrow paths in the snow between tipis. They brought meat, shared hot drinks made from herbs, or simply sat and talked. It wasn't the isolation we often imagine when we think nomads in the snow. It was social, warm, and interdependent. Because when it's minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit, you don't survive by being alone. You survive by being together. Feeding the fire was life, and keeping it alive was an art. Wood wasn't always easy to find on the plains, especially in midwinter, so families planned ahead. They gathered driftwood from rivers, old branches, and sometimes dried buffalo dung, which, surprisingly, burned cleanly and steadily, producing less smoke than greenwood. You might wrinkle your nose, but in that world, it was just fuel. A dried buffalo chip could heat a tipi and cook a meal just fine. Children helped collect it. Women kept small caches near the door. And the fire, even a small one, burned nearly all night. Some elders said you should never let the fire go completely out because a cold tipi wasn't just uncomfortable. It was bad luck. Fire represented life itself, a constant link between people and the spirit world. So they tended it carefully, like a family member. Food, warmth, and energy. Staying warm wasn't just about the shelter, it was also about what went inside you. Winter diets were high in fat. Dried meat, marrow, rendered tallow. These were energy bombs that helped bodies endure long cold nights. Buffalo meat was the staple, but they also ate dried berries, pemmican, a mix of fat, meat, and fruit, and soups thick enough to chew. A hot meal before sleep did more than fill the stomach. It helped maintain internal warmth. The heat from digestion lasted hours like a natural radiator. They understood this instinctively. Nobody wrote it down, but you can't fake centuries of successful winter gatherings and story nights when the wind was too fierce to hunt. Families huddled inside and told stories. The fire flickered, the hides rustled, and someone, maybe an elder, began talking about how the buffalo got their humps, or how the stars came to be, about brave hunters, tricky coyotes, and spirits that lived in rivers. These stories weren't random entertainment. They were education, memory, and comfort rolled together. Children learned where they came from, how to behave, and what to fear. And when you think about it, storytelling was the perfect heat source. It kept minds alive while bodies rested. So maybe the warmth inside those tipis wasn't just physical. It was emotional, shared, passed along like a flame. Sleeping positions and layering tricks. Let's get a bit practical again because surviving cold nights is all about strategy. Families slept close, often arranged in a circular pattern with feet toward the fire. People used layers, robes, fur blankets, even grass padding under the hides. Some tipis had partitions made from hides or cloths that divided space. A smaller sleeping zone could trap heat better. Think of it as prehistoric room insulation. The fire's position also mattered. It wasn't dead center, as you might assume. It was slightly offset to control airflow and reduce smoke drift toward sleeping areas. These little tweaks added up to major comfort. And because the tipis could breathe air flowing in low, smoke out high, the air never felt stale. So even when the temperature outside dropped to bone-cracking levels, inside it hovered just above freezing, which, in context, was luxury. Winter migrations. It's worth remembering that plains tribes didn't always stay in the harshest zones through winter. Many followed seasonal routes, moving into river valleys or wooded areas where the wind broke and firewood was easier to find. Moving camp in snow was hard but not impossible. Horses pulled travois loaded with hides and poles. People wrapped in furs walked beside them. And within a few hours, the new camp rose again, a fresh ring of tipis against a white horizon. They didn't just survive winter, they worked with it. Following herds, avoiding blizzards, timing everything to nature's rhythm. It's something that seems almost impossible now, in our climate-controlled world. But for them, it was routine. When cold became memory sometimes, after a long winter, the people marked its end with small rituals, songs, dances, or offerings, not out of celebration, but gratitude. Survival itself was worth honoring. Every tipi that still stood in spring was proof of skill and care, or fires tended well, hides repaired, children kept safe. When they moved on to new hunting grounds, they left almost nothing behind. The fire pits were covered, the snow melted over the footprints, and by the next season, even the wind forgot they'd been there. But in memory and in stories, those winters stayed, not as tales of suffering but as lessons about endurance. Looking from the outside in, when explorers and settlers finally arrived in those same winters, they often froze. Literally, they built square cabins, drafty, smoky, impossible to heat evenly. They slept under damp wool and wondered why their fires filled the house with smoke, and all around them, the tipis stood quietly, warm, efficient, and ancient. It must have been humbling to realize that the people they thought of as primitive had mastered survival in an environment that left European designs gasping for mercy. But that's the story of history, isn't it? The solutions that work best are often the ones that look simplest. The warmth of knowing how, as the fire in our imaginary tipi flickers lower, you can see why this way of living worked. It wasn't about domination over nature. It was about cooperation. They knew how to listen to the wind, how to feel the ground, how to tell when snow would fall. Their homes reflected that understanding, flexible, breathable, balanced. And when night came, when the cold pressed close against the hides and the wind moaned through the poles, they didn't fear it. They'd just pull the blanket higher, feed the fire a little, and drift off to sleep knowing they were exactly where they were supposed to be. Hey there, let's settle back in. The fire's glowing low again, snow brushing gently against the hides. You can almost hear the quiet creak of the poles as the wind shifts. We've already talked about how Native Americans built and lived in tipis, the structure, the warmth, the way it all worked so effortlessly with the land. But there was another layer to it. A layer of meaning, beauty, and memory painted right onto the walls. Because these shelters weren't just practical, they were personal. They told stories. The painted home tipis were canvases before canvas even existed. Tribes like the Lakota, Blackfoot, and Crow often decorated the outer hides with symbols and designs. Not just for show, these were records. Histories, dreams turned visible. Each mark meant something. A red handprint might symbolize a warrior's victory. A circle of stars could represent a family's connection to the sky. Some tipis were painted only after a significant event like a successful hunt, a powerful vision, or the birth of a child. The designs varied from family to family, and from season to season. You could walk through a winter camp and read it like a quiet museum. Here was the tipi of a man who dreamed of a white buffalo. Next to it, the home of a healer, marked with zigzag lines for lightning and power. Across from that, one decorated with tracks of elk, symbols of endurance. And at night, the firelight inside made the artwork come alive. The flicker of flames moved the painted buffalo across the walls as if they were running again. There's something poetic about that. How a home built to survive cold also held warmth for the imagination. Aesthetics of function. The beauty of a tipi wasn't just in decoration though. It was in proportion. The geometry was deliberate. The base wide enough for air to circulate, the top narrow enough to hold heat. The poles curved ever so slightly inward, not stiff and straight like lumber, but alive, bending with weather. The hides overlapped just enough to seal tight without tearing. Even the door flap was positioned for balance, both practical and symbolic. Everything about it felt organic, as if it had grown there, not been built. And in a way it had. Each part came from the land, poles from pine or spruce, hides from buffalo, sinew thread from animals hunted for food. Nothing imported, nothing wasted. The design had evolved like a species. Survival shaping beauty. The symbolism of warmth in native belief systems. Warmth wasn't only physical, it was spiritual. Fire was sacred, a bridge between the human world and the unseen. It gave life, carried prayers upward in smoke, and reminded everyone that existence itself depended on care. Some tribes saw the fire at the tipi center as representing the family's heart. To let it go out without reason wasn't just lazy, it was almost disrespectful. So every night, when someone added wood or stirred the coals, it wasn't just a chore, it was a small act of gratitude, a way of saying, we're still here. And in a world where nature could kill you any given week, that mattered. Design differences across tribes. Not every tribe built the same kind of tipi. The Lakota used tall, slender tipis, optimized for high winds. The Blackfoot built slightly shorter, broader ones that resisted cold better. The Crow sometimes preferred steeper angles to shed snow quickly. Some lined the inside walls with willow mats or extra hides. Others used bark or woven reeds in milder regions. The materials shifted to in places where buffalo was scarce. Elk or deer hides replaced them. Later, when trade brought canvas, many tribes adapted using lighter, easier to sew cloth without losing the original design principles. That's what makes the tipi so remarkable. It was never rigid, it changed shape, but never lost its soul. Even today, modern replicas still follow the same pattern because it's already perfect. How they managed condensation, yes, really. You wouldn't think prehistoric architects worried about condensation, but they kind of did. The air inside a tipi was warm and moist, people breathing, cooking, sleeping. The outside air was freezing, so moisture naturally condensed on the inner walls, but the hides breathed. They absorbed a little moisture and released it when the fire warmed them. That kept things from turning damp and icy. Compare that to a European cabin, where you'd often wake up with frozen breath crystals on the ceiling. Tipis had none of that claustrophobic chill. Just steady air, never too dry or wet. It's the sort of quiet detail you'd only notice after centuries of trial or a few dozen very cold mistakes. Winter color and light. The inside of a tipi wasn't dark and dreary, even in winter. Firelight made everything warm, gold and orange. Hides glowed like honey. Smoke curled upward, soft and slow. Shadows of poles and people painted delicate lines across the ceiling. Sometimes colored beads or feathers hung from the poles, catching the light. A breeze from the smoke hole would make them sway. If you've ever watched firelight on fabric, you know that hypnotic rhythm. It's half the reason this script probably has you sleepy right now. Imagine that, every night, for months, the same flicker, the same calm. No lamps, no screens, no noise, just warmth, breath, and stillness. That's not just sleep. That's meditation disguised as survival. Sleeping through the deep cold, the coldest nights, the ones where breath froze mid-air, required teamwork. People slept even closer, shared furs, and often kept small embers glowing near the center to restart the fire easily before dawn. They didn't wake up shivering. They woke up to the faint sound of crackling, maybe a soft murmur as someone added wood. And if snow built up too high around the outside, it wasn't a problem, it made the tipi warmer. The snow pressed against the hides, sealing drafts like natural insulation. It's strange to think the very thing that looked deadly, the snow, was also part of what kept them safe. That kind of irony feels like something nature came up with just to prove a point. The tipi as a living space during the day. The tipi transformed. Bedding was rolled up and hung or stacked. The central fire became the cooking area. Tools were unpacked, repairs made, hides softened. The space was always multi-purposed, a bedroom, kitchen, workshop, and spiritual center all in one circle. Children played quietly inside when storms hit. Adults worked on beadwork or clothing. Smoke rose constantly, marking time in a world without clocks. It's easy to picture the rhythm. Morning smoke thin and blue, midday thicker as cooking fires start, evening darker and fragrant with roasted meat. You could probably tell the hour just by glancing at the color of the smoke over camp. Keeping clean and warm without plumbing. You might be wondering, how did anyone stay clean in that cold? There weren't daily baths, obviously. Water was precious, and ice baths weren't exactly spa material. Instead, people used dry cleaning methods, brushing with soft grasses, washing hands and faces with melted snow, and using herbs for scent and disinfection. Sage, sweetgrass, and cedar weren't just for ceremony. They helped cleanse the air and body. Some tribes built small sweat lodges nearby, dome-shaped steam baths lined with hot stones and water poured for vapor. After sweating out grime and fatigue, they'd cool off in the snow, then return to the tipi, clean, relaxed, and warm from the inside out. It sounds brutal, but it was incredibly effective. And oddly enough, people who lived that way got sick less often than many early settlers crammed into smoky, damp cabins. The emotional warmth of belonging there, as a quiet kind of warmth that doesn't come from fire. It comes from knowing you belong somewhere. A tipi was more than a building. It was family space. Every sound, from the rustle of hides to the crack of a log, meant life was continuing. Children grew up associating that rhythm with safety. Adults carried those memories even after tipis faded from daily use. It's probably why when many native communities began living in wooden houses or government-built housing, Elders sometimes said those new walls felt wrong. They missed the breath of the tipi, the circle, the fire in the center, the way heat and people both flowed freely without corners or edges. There's something deeply human about that, the need for shelter that feels alive, not boxed in. European curiosity and misunderstanding. When outsiders wrote about Tipis, their tone was usually one of confusion mixed with mild awe. Missionaries noted how astonishingly warm they were. Soldiers commented on how smoke did not choke the inhabitants, and one early traveler claimed the women could take down and rebuild the entire structure in less than an hour, which sounded impossible but was true. Still, they missed the deeper point. They saw efficiency. They didn't see philosophy. The tipi wasn't just a clever tent. It was a statement about living lightly, taking only what was needed, staying mobile, respecting what kept you alive. To the native mind, a home that could move was a home that didn't own the land, it honored it. Which, in hindsight, feels like a message we could still use. Passing down the skill, the knowledge of tipi making was passed down quietly from mothers to daughters, from one generation's hands to the next. Girls learned to scrape hides, measure poles by eye, and stitch seams so tight no wind could sneak through. Boys learned how to cut and haul poles without splintering them. No blueprints, no manuals, just memory and muscle. By the time a young woman married, she could build her family's tipi from scratch. Her skill wasn't decoration, it was survival training. When you think about it, that's the purest kind of architecture school there is. The soundtrack of survival. Every season had its sounds. In winter, wind, fire, breath. In spring, dripping snow, birds, laughter, as people stepped outside again. Inside, there was always that steady background hum, hides shifting, wood crackling, an occasional sneeze, a baby fussing. Ordinary life, framed by a circle of light in an endless plain of white. And somehow, that sound, that quiet, became the lullaby of the plains. Even centuries later, if you sit near a small fire and listen long enough, you can almost hear it again. The sleep of the untroubled. Let's return, for a moment, to that sleeping scene we started with. The fire's down to embers. The wind outside is gentle, brushing snow across the hides. Inside, everyone's bundled close. Parents, children, grandparents. The air smells like wood and fur. The warmth feels steady, old, reliable. You might expect sleeplessness from all that hardship, but they slept deeply. Not because life was easy, but because it made sense. Every sound, every flicker, every breath was part of a rhythm they understood. That's what safety really is, not walls or locks, but harmony with the world outside. And in that balance, they found rest. So, let's drift into the heart of winter life. Imagine it's February, somewhere on the Great Plains. The wind sounds like a ghost playing a flute through the cracks of the earth. Snow piles up against the sides of the tipi, but inside, the air is steady and calm, with the faint hum of the fire in the middle. The tipi wasn't just a structure, it was a living system designed to breathe, warm, and protect. The fire pit sat exactly in the center, beneath a smoke hole that could be adjusted with flaps at the top. Too smoky, open them wider. Too cold, pull them tight. It was early climate control, new thermostat, no complaint department, just muscle memory and know-how passed down through generations. The hides stretched over the poles were often treated with a mix of fat and smoke that made them water-resistant. Rain and snow would slide off, while the smoke from the fire gently rose through the vent, creating that cozy, earthy smell that clings to your hair and clothes. The base of the tipi could also be lined with extra hides or even snow, which might sound strange, but compacted snow actually worked as insulation. It kept the warmth in and the cold wind out, and no one was just lying there freezing. Buffalo robes were thick enough to make even the worst winter night survivable. Sometimes, people slept in pairs or groups, sharing heat under layers of hides. Children were tucked close to their mothers, and elders were placed away from the draft, near the fire or behind a hide wall that blocked the chill. Everyone had their place, like a human heating grid. Life inside wasn't silent either. The soft crackle of firewood, the hiss of water warming in a pot, the muffled snore from someone already asleep, all of it blended into a rhythm of survival that was both simple and brilliant. When storms came, tipis were lowered slightly and anchored with extra stakes and rawhide ropes. The whole thing flexed with the wind rather than fighting it. A tipi could take a beating that would wreck a wooden cabin, and still stand proud the next morning, lightly frosted but unfazed. And because the poles were reusable, the covering hides were easy to pack, and the design was symmetrical, families could take the whole thing down and move camp within an hour. You couldn't exactly say that about your suburban home. Inside, daily life went on, cooking, mending, storytelling. Children played near the fire, being told to watch the embers but, of course, not listening. Elders shared tales of how the buffalo came to the earth, or how stars were once people who climbed into the sky. These weren't just bedtime stories, they were survival guides wrapped in myth. Even the fire was more than warmth, it was social gravity. It marked the center of the family's world. The space around it was divided. Men's tools on one side, women's belongings on another. Sacred objects wrapped and hung high, looked down like quiet guardians. Everything had meaning, even the way shadows moved on the hide walls. So when the nights dragged long and the wind howled like it had a personal grudge, the people inside didn't just endure, they adapted, they listened, they laughed, they told stories that filled the dark with something warmer than firelight. Let's drift a little further now to what mornings were like when the sun returned, and how those same skills carried through the seasons, shaping not just survival, but community itself. So now, let's imagine morning, the kind where the light creeps in slowly through the smoke flaps, turning the air gold and dusty. The fires burned low, just a quiet bed of red embers whispering in the ashes. You can hear soft movement, someone stirring the coals, another stretching beneath heavy buffalo hides, the muffled cough of a child waking up to the cold. That moment before sunrise was a ritual of its own. Before anyone spoke much, the fire had to be coaxed back to life. A few dry twigs, maybe some kindling tucked under a hide overnight so it didn't freeze solid. One spark, a slow exhale, and warmth began to crawl back into the space. The sound of it, the faint crackle, was as familiar as breathing. Coffee wasn't a thing yet for most of these tribes, but they had their own warm morning drinks, teas made from willow bark, cedar, or wild mint. The smell filled the tipi, mixing with smoke and animal hide. Someone would step outside, wrapped in a robe, and check the horizon. The land stretched endlessly, flat and pale under snow, broken only by a trail of steam rising from other tipis nearby. Mornings were practical but calm. Fires were fed, snow melted for water, and dogs were checked because, yes, dogs were part of camp life long before horses ever showed up. They carried small loads, guarded the camp, and occasionally stole a bit of breakfast when no one was looking. Breakfast itself was simple, maybe dried buffalo meat, some rendered fat, and berries if any were left from summer. Sometimes it was just warmth and conversation, a few quiet laughs before the day began. Then came the chores. Men went to check traps or hunt, women scraped hides or mended clothing. Kids did what kids always do, half help, half get in the way. But even that chaos had rhythm. Everyone knew their role, and it shifted with the seasons, not clocks or calendars. What's easy to miss in all of this, especially when we think of survival, is that the people living this way didn't see it as struggle. The tipi wasn't a makeshift shelter or some compromise with nature. It was nature shaped to human rhythm. Warmth wasn't tea, something they fought for every night. It was something they understood how to make and hold on to. When the wind howled again, and the snow tried to push in through every gap, they knew the tipi could flex, bend, and still protect them. And when the fire glowed at night, they didn't see it as a luxury. It was family, memory, life itself. You can almost picture it, the soft glow of orange light on tan hide, the gentle voices, the slow lull of stories about the past. For all our modern insulation and double-glazed windows, most of us have never been that close to warmth. So when we say how did they sleep without freezing, the answer isn't about secret materials or survival hacks. It's about understanding your world so well that even the cold becomes part of your rhythm. Let's float a little further, to how this deep connection with fire, hide, and sky began to fade, and what happened when the world outside the tipi started closing in. So, let us move gently forward to a time when the tipi wasn't just a home, but a symbol of a way of life that was about to be tested. By the mid-1800s, the Great Plains were changing fast. The same open sky, the same grasslands that had fed bison and families for centuries, were now echoing with the sound of wagon wheels, gunfire, and iron rails being hammered into the ground. The tipi, that perfect machine of warmth and movement, was never built for fences or borders. It was made for a people who followed herds, who read the land like a map written in stars and hoofprints. But the US government and settlers didn't see that as freedom. They saw it as empty space waiting to be used. And so began the slow unraveling. Treaties were made, then broken. Hunting grounds shrank. The buffalo herds, once numbering in the tens of millions, were slaughtered by the millions, sometimes just for sport, sometimes as policy. You can't really overstate how devastating that was. Without the buffalo, everything, food, clothing, shelter, became harder. Imagine trying to live through a winter without the animal that gave you not just meat, but hides for your tipi, sinew for your tools, bones for your needles. You could still build a tipi, but it became a rare luxury. Some switched to canvas when it became available, traded or stolen from army tents. It worked, but it wasn't the same. Canvas didn't breathe like hide. It didn't smell like the earth after rain. The tipi, once a living part of the land, became something else, a relic, a memory of freedom. The government wanted permanent housing on reservations. Wooden houses, square and still, lined up like they were designed to erase motion itself. And yet, people resisted in quiet ways. Some families kept their tipis standing beside the new wooden houses, sleeping inside when they could. Others used the old structures in ceremonies or gatherings, keeping the traditions alive in whispers and gestures. Because when your home has been passed down through generations, not the wood or the poles, but the way of living, it doesn't vanish easily. In a strange way, the tipi survived because of its simplicity. You can still find them today at powwows, cultural sites, or even in the backyards of native families who refuse to let the old ways disappear completely. Modern ones might use nylon or treated canvas, but the spirit's the same. poles rising to meet at the center, an opening at the top for the smoke, a circle on the ground reminding everyone inside that life is connected, not boxed in. And yes, people still sleep in them, some for ceremony, some for comfort, some just to feel what their ancestors felt on long cold nights under the stars. The warmth still gathers the same way. The fire still hums quietly. The smell of wood smoke still clings to your skin and clothes. It's easy to romanticize that, to turn it into nostalgia. But what really kept those people alive wasn't magic, or toughness, or even luck. It was knowledge. A deep, slow, generational understanding of how to live with the cold, not against it. So when you think of a tipi glowing faintly in a snowstorm, don't picture struggle. Picture mastery, humans who looked at winter, nodded, and said, "We know what to do. Let's drift one last time, to the quiet after it all," when the fires burned low, and the stars above still remembered the smoke that once rose from thousands of tipis across the plains. So here we are, the end of the story, or maybe just the soft part after it. The tipi stands in the dark, its poles rising against a sky that's more stars than black. The fire inside has burned low again, just faint embers pulsing like a heartbeat. Outside, the wind moves through the grass the way it always has, whispering across the plains, carrying stories no one wrote down. If you listen long enough, you can almost hear what it sounded like 100, 200 years ago, before railroads, before fences, before the endless noise of the modern world. Just the soft shuffle of people settling in for the night, a low hum of voices, maybe the cry of a wolf far off somewhere. The tipi wasn't just shelter, it was a map of everything people believed in. The circle at its base wasn't random. It was the world, complete and connected. The fire at the center was life. The smoke that rose through the opening was spirit, always reaching for the sky. The poles themselves represented the connection between earth and the heavens, the idea that everything physical and spiritual was bound together. It's not hard to see why they slept so peacefully. You'd have to, when your roof was literally a reminder that the sky was watching over you. By the time the 20th century rolled around, many of these ways of life had been almost erased, but not quite. Elders kept the stories alive. They taught younger generations how to set the poles just right, how to anchor the cover, how to find that balance between warmth and breath. Because a tipi that's too sealed gets smoky, and one that's too open freezes you out. It's like life, all about finding that space where you can breathe without losing your heat. And even now, in the quiet corners of powwows or private gatherings, you can still find that glow, a small fire, a circle of people, voices low, the air thick with the scent of smoke and pine. They may not be sleeping to survive the winter anymore, but they're still sleeping inside memory, inside a story that refuses to fade. It's funny, in a way. We spend so much money now trying to make our homes natural, minimal or energy efficient. But these structures, built with nothing but wood, hide, and knowledge, were already all of that. Perfectly balanced, perfectly adapted. So, how did Native Americans sleep in tipis without freezing? They didn't conquer the cold, they lived alongside it. They didn't build walls to block out nature, they built spaces that breathed with it. They trusted the fire, the hides, and their understanding of the seasons. And maybe that's something worth remembering now, in our world of thermostats and glowing screens. Because there is something deeply peaceful about a life that doesn't fight the world around it. A life that listens instead. So tonight, as you drift off, think of that glow in the distance. A small fire under a tall sky. A people who learn to turn winter into warmth. The embers fade, the smoke rises, and the stars stay where they've always been. Patient, quiet, and eternal. Let's linger a little longer, not because there's more to explain, but because the quiet after the fire deserves time to breathe. Imagine the plains at dawn. The tipi stands still, its hide walls pale against the blue-gray of early morning. The snow crunches faintly underfoot, and thin ribbons of smoke drift upward into a sky so wide it almost swallows the world. You can smell the ash, the faint sweetness of burned wood, the cold bite of air that hasn't yet been touched by the sun. Someone steps out of the tipi, maybe a young man, maybe an elder wrapping a buffalo robe tighter around his shoulders. His breath fogs in front of him, and he looks across the land, waiting for the first streak of light. Behind him, the fire inside flickers back to life. It's not dramatic, just steady, familiar, the same way it's been for generations. That's the rhythm people live by. Fire, wind, sky, sleep, and story, all blending into something that didn't need clocks or calendars. Every part of their world had purpose. Every sound, the pop of a log, the whistle of wind through the poles, the distant cry of a bird meant something. It told you how the day would go, how the air would move, when it was time to rest. And even after centuries of change, after forced relocations, after the buffalo were gone and the old ways were pushed aside, that rhythm still hums quietly in the background. You can hear it in the songs sung at gatherings, in the stories told around modern campfires, in the hands that still know how to tie a hide just right. The tipi has become a symbol now, not just of survival, but of identity. You see them at cultural centers, powwows, even in art and film. But behind the symbol is something more profound. A reminder that comfort doesn't always come from what we build. Sometimes it comes from what we remember. For thousands of winters, people slept warm not because they fought the cold, but because they respected it. They knew when to rise, when to rest, when to move, and when to stay. Their knowledge wasn't written down, it was practiced, taught, repeated, until it became instinct. And maybe that's why the idea of a tipi still feels peaceful today. It represents a balance we've mostly forgotten, one where life wasn't about control, but harmony. So if you close your eyes tonight and picture it, the fire glowing softly, the smoke slipping through the vent, the murmur of voices fading into quiet, it's easy to understand how they slept. They weren't alone in the cold. They were surrounded by warmth. They built themselves, guided by a kind of wisdom that didn't need words. Outside, the stars begin to dim. Inside, the embers rest. The land exhales. And the tipi, patient, breathing, alive, waits for another night, another fire, another story to begin. Let's linger a little longer, not in snow or cold, but in thought. The story of the tipi isn't just about surviving winter. It's about a way of seeing the world. Think about it, a structure made entirely of materials from the land around it, designed not to conquer nature but to live with it. Poles from trees, hides from animals, firewood from nearby driftwood, and the knowledge of generations guiding every stitch and every placement. That wasn't coincidence. It was understanding, deep, quiet, practical understanding of how the world worked and how humans fit into it. We've spent the last several hours tracing the life of a winter night in a tipi, the fire, the hides, the stories, the rhythms. And if there's one thing that becomes clear, it's that warmth isn't just a matter of physical heat. It's knowledge, care, and community. It's watching the embers glow with someone you love, and knowing that everything outside, the wind, the snow, the night itself, is no longer a threat, but a rhythm you've learned to follow. The tipi also teaches resilience. Even when the world outside changed, railroads, fences, settlers, the knowledge of how to make shelter, how to stay warm, how to read the land, didn't disappear. It was passed down, adapted, preserved, and even today, you can see it in ceremonial tipis, in cultural gatherings, in the hands of people who still build them for education or tradition. And perhaps the softest lesson is about simplicity. We often equate survival with complexity. Modern heating, thick walls, gadgets. But a fire in the center of a well-built circle of hides can do more than all that. It teaches patience, observation, intuition, listening to the wind, feeling the cold, adjusting a flap here, adding a stick there. That's real skill. So tonight, if you imagine a tipi in a snowy plain, it's not just a tent. It's a lesson in living lightly, fully, intentionally. It's warmth in every sense, physical, mental, and emotional. And as the embers fade and the fire whispers, it leaves a quiet echo that humans don't have to fight nature to survive. Sometimes, we just need to learn its rhythm and follow it. And in that rhythm, there's sleep, there's peace, there's home.